welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life, not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show on iTunes, or use our RSS feed with your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter, Instagram, and SoundCloud at vmspod, at facebook.com/virtual memories show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and review. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon or PayPal. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod and set up your level of support. Every week you'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. It's time for the last interview episode of the year. Next week is our annual guest list episode, and I'm taking that week between Christmas and New Year off, so we'll be back with scintillating conversation on January 2nd in time for our 250th episode. Now, our guest this week is Cullen Murphy, editor-at-large at Vanity Fair, and the author of the new book, Cartoon County, My Father and His Friends in the Golden Age of Make-Believe, published by Farrar, Straus Giroux. Murphy's dad was John Cullen Murphy, the artist who succeeded Hal Foster on the comic strip Prince Valiant. And the book's about his father's life and the just incredible community of cartoonists and illustrators and other artists who lived in the same southeast corner of Connecticut in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Cullen, he writes really affectionately about his father's career as an artist, from his training to his time in the military to how he got out of bad military service by being a good artist, to his stint drawing Big Ben Bolt, a strip I will admit I had never heard of before I read Cartoon County, and on through Prince Valiant and into his decline. But at the same time, the book's not just about John Cullen Murphy. It's about the whole time and place, this area of Connecticut, this era when a syndicated comic strip could support an artist and his family and leave lots of time for rounds of golf. The book renders those days really well, and the camaraderie among this whole so-called Connecticut school. In fact, that camaraderie kind of sort of mirrors Prince Valiant's ascension to the Knights of the Round Table. Not that I want to draw too much of a parallel between that work and the life that John Cullen Murphy was living. But it's really a beautiful book. It's a lovely story about like I said, a time and a place, and about what it meant to be an artist in that era. And the thing is, Cartoon County's not just a story about that time. It's also physically this absolutely gorgeous edition. It is filled with this mind-blowing selection of cartoons and paintings and letters and other visual material that kind of sets off the story. It's just a gorgeous production. I hope you check it out. Maybe get it as a present for the cartoon person in your life, or right around, it's Hanukkah tonight and Christmas is coming up soon. So there are some minor caveats for the episode. First, we recorded at the Vanity Fair offices, so there's some general New York sound, police sirens, obviously, but nothing too serious. The real caveat is my disappointment in my performance in this episode, in that I wish I talked more with Cullen about his work as an editor. We really focus on the book and his father and cartooning. And I get the feeling we could have gone another hour at least just talking about him and his life, but the flow wasn't there. He had a day job. We were there first thing in the morning at his office, so I didn't want to try and take up too much of his time. But I'm hoping maybe we'll get an opportunity down the line. Oh, and I should point out that this whole episode came about because of that story I told you a few weeks ago about bumping into Graydon Carter, the outgoing editor of Vanity Fair, at the airport in Ottawa. He suggested I connect with Cullen, told me about the book, and here we are. And actually, we recorded the morning after what was apparently a very late-night farewell party for Graydon Carter, which may explain why, when I was leaving the offices around 10 a.m. after our conversation, I did not see all that many staff present. Anyway, I'm still hoping to get Carter on sometime in 2018, and I'll keep you apprised about that. And here's Cullen's bio. Cullen Murphy is the editor-at-large at Vanity Fair and the former managing editor of the Atlantic Monthly. His books include Are We Rome?, The Fall of an Empire and the Fate of America, and God's Jury, The Inquisition and the Making of the Modern World. For 25 years, he collaborated with his father, the illustrator John Cullen Murphy, on the comic strip Prince Valiant. He lives in Massachusetts with his family. His new book is Cartoon County, My Father and His Friends in the Golden Age of Make-Believe. And now, the Virtual Memories Conversation with Cullen Murphy. So I wanted to ask about the origins of Cartoon County, but in the context of whether, in a sense, it was the attempt at justifying having almost 30 years of Prince Valiant writing on your CV. Is that the original impetus for it, or more of an affectionate look at your father and your upbringing?
Well, no, I never felt that was something I needed to justify. I always enjoyed doing the strip. I always enjoyed working with my father, and having grown up in that world, it never really occurred to me that there was something that was, truly off the charts about it. Remember, when I'm growing up, going out to the studio, getting to know my father's friends, seeing what my father did every single day. All of this seemed utterly normal to me, whereas all of those people who had what I now regard as normal jobs, they got onto the train in the morning, they went into New York to Madison Avenue or Wall Street, those people seemed like very odd ducks. So what really motivated me to write this book was seeing how rapidly this world that I had taken for granted was disappearing. And this was not the first sign of it, but it was the sign that was most powerful, was my father's death in 2004. He was 85 at the time. And with his passing, it was a very stark reminder that not only he, but the world that he lived in was coming to an end. And of course, since 2004, other people have passed away. And so it eventually occurred to me, this is all going to be gone. And if someone doesn't preserve what this world was like in its heyday, in the middle of the American century, it's never going to happen. So it became a kind of just a personal mission to do it, and for the sake of my family as well.
Had your father ever nudged you about this? Like, oh, you ought to write a book about this someday, son.
No, he never did. He was not the sort of person who would do something like that. He was, although he was a very gregarious person, he was also a very humble person. And self-promotion was not a big characteristic of his. It may even be that he should have been more self-promotional. Some people in creative fields are very self-promotional.
But you mentioned most of them are not, do not have great business acumen.
Right. Most of them are not great business people. And but there was a point in the 1990s when I decided I would write about one aspect of my father's career, and that was his period during the war. Now, to back up a little bit, he had wanted to be an artist all his life. I have drawings of his that go back to when he was, 5 or 6 years old. And he had trained as an illustrator. He'd gone to the Art Students League. He lived down the street from Norman Rockwell. And he was already pretty well embarked on a career as an illustrator when World War II broke out. Now, he was young. He was 22, 23 years old, but he had sold a lot of work, and that's what he would have done. But during the war is when I think his talent really blossomed in many different directions. He learned how to do cartoon type drawings and paintings, with pen and ink and washes, very realistic, not like Beetle Bailey. He learned how to do portraits, to a very high standard, and landscape watercolors. Anyway, he experimented with an awful lot of things, and having gotten to know a lot of his work from the war, I thought this could be an interesting thing to write about, and I did for American Heritage magazine, and they published lots of his drawings and paintings, and he did like that. He said, I remember talking to him after it came out, he said, it's like reading your own obituary, which he meant in a good way, because his feeling was most people don't ever get to read their obituaries, and isn't that too bad? Because you finally realize what people felt about you. So I have no doubt that he would like a book like this, but there was no nudging from him.
Can you recount some of the factors that, I know you talk about it in the opening of the book, that led to such a profusion of cartoonists and illustrators all settling in that southeastern Connecticut zone?
When I was growing up, I was certainly aware that there sure were a lot of cartoonists and illustrators and comic book artists in that neck of the woods. And it didn't really occur to me to wonder why this was the case. It is a nice place to live. But eventually, in talking with a lot of cartoonists, just asking each of them, so why did you move out here? It began to become clear that there was a constellation of factors that all came together. So one was, these people were young. They had been in the war. They were getting married. They were starting families. They were mostly based in and around New York because of another factor, which is publishing magazines, syndicates are mainly based in New York. I'll come back to that. But they didn't necessarily see Manhattan as the place where they wanted to raise their children. So in looking around, they looked to the suburbs. And some of the close-in suburbs, like Westchester, were extremely expensive at that time. And whereas Connecticut, now deemed to be the expensive place, Fairfield County, Greenwich, Stamford, was open territory. Land was plentiful, houses were cheap, so you could get to Fairfield County, and you really had a lot of choices. So that was one thing. Another thing was that a number of illustrators and cartoonists had moved out there already. A small group, but enough of a nucleus so that you knew, if I move there, I'm not alone. And all you need is like 6 or 7 people to start that migration.
If that guy can make it here, I can.
That's right. And I already know him, and so there was that. There's also the fact that there was a train. It's only an hour from Greenwich or Stamford into Manhattan, which is great. So you could be tethered to the city. Connecticut at that time also had no income tax, whereas New York and New Jersey did. So that was another factor. And finally, just to come back to the Manhattan itself, you did have to be close to Manhattan in those days. Nowadays, the communications is such that, you can just email your strip in if you want to. You can live every place, and as a result, people do live every place, because why not? But in those days, you had to be close to Manhattan for a lot of reasons. One was just to drum up work if you were a gag cartoonist, going in, visiting people. There was the famous Look Day, when all the gag cartoonists would come to Manhattan and go door to door to magazines and try to sell their cartoons. You can't do that from California. And cartoonists were always working on a deadline, and frequently were late. So sometimes they had to physically come into the city and deliver their work rather than sending it through the mails. So this Manhattan was definitely a magnet that kept everybody close for a long period of time. So the result was that, I'd say by the mid-50s or 1960, there probably were 100 or more cartoonists. It could be more when you think of the assistants who were involved, and when you include gag cartoonists and certain kinds of illustrators and all the comic strip artists. But anyway, that group was well assembled by the time I really became aware of things, and it was very close knit too. They socialized a lot, and they did things together, like golf. There were a lot of parties, and so if a kid growing up in one of those families could not help but be aware of the fact that that you were in the middle of something that was fairly close knit and extensive.
Did they have a grasp of the golden age that they were in, or was it always the hassle of the day-to-day job and not quite realizing how special that period was?
I think from time to time there were certain glimpses of awareness, but it wasn't something on their minds.
It never is.
Right. You don't know the golden age while you're living through it. Dick Brown used to refer to the people he knew, this wider group, as the Connecticut school, kind of jokingly. So that betrays a kind of awareness of the size and significance of the group. Now, he wasn't all that serious about using that term, but on the other hand, he wasn't not serious either. I think it really began to dawn on people rather late, as it was beginning to fade. And again, that's typical of golden ages.
And what do you think led to the decline outside of the basic tenets of mortality? Or is it really just the basic tenets of mortality? That's.
Well, the tenets of mortality are powerful and inescapable, and there certainly is that. I remember Jerry Dumas, who did Sam and Silo and Sam's Strip, talking to me once about a drawing that he and Mort Walker had done, and it's a picture of two cartoon characters up in a balloon, and they're above Fairfield County. And below them you see a map of Fairfield County, and it has all these names drawn into it. And those are names of cartoonists. And it's not even all the cartoonists, because you just couldn't fit them all. But it was a nice conceit, and it captured the idea of, look how many of us there are. And but Jerry was saying how he had come across this map not long before. This conversation was probably 5 years ago, actually it was longer than that. And he had started putting a red line through all the names of people who had died, and it just became too much, and he had to put it away. So mortality does take its toll, but there are other things as well. One of them I alluded to earlier is simply the capacity for mobility. You don't have to live around New York City any longer, and therefore you don't. So simply in a physical sense, that caused a dissipation of the Fairfield County group. And then there are larger structural issues that have affected, the newspaper industry, which by extension means affecting the comic strip industry. And we're aware of the fact that newspapers are shutting down. There's so many fewer now than there were, even 10 years ago. Small local papers, the Sunday editions, used to have Sunday comics pages. It wasn't just the big metropolitan dailies. Newspapers began scrimping on costs by reducing the size of things. So the comics got smaller and smaller, and there were fewer and fewer comics in the funny pages, which had the effect of throwing things into a little bit of a spiral, where once you had these glorious 16 pages of Puck the Comic Weekly, that was how could you not stop and look at it? The comics began to seem more like a color advertising supplement. So that that also took its toll just on the the core of the business itself.
Did you ever want to draw growing up?
Sure, and my father taught most of us kids.
You had 7 siblings, which
I have 7 siblings, and many of us can draw fairly well because we, my father was patient and taught us the rudiments. How do you draw a face? Where in your head are the eyes? A kid, when they draw a face, they will always put the eyes way at the top of the oval, but it's not where they are. They're halfway through your face. Just little things like that over time you began to get the rudiments. How do you do perspective? How do you draw a house that looks 3D? So, as I say, many of us learned how to draw fairly well, but I don't think any of us were tempted to, go into that line of work, even if all of us in different ways are creative. I think that's something that actually does come through the family. And it was probably a good decision too. It's hard to compete with someone in your family, an older person in your family, who is doing something very, very well that you kind of toy with the idea of doing yourself. There are a lot of dangers in that.
Yeah. Now, in writing, we always harken back outside of the Amoses. You really don't have a lot of father and son.
That's right. And you do have some, and the Evelyn Waugh family has a lot. And you can come up with some good examples, but it's potentially fraught, and you may be inviting unspecified troubles that it's wiser to just keep at bay.
Yeah, was there any sense of Cullen's working with Dad to get more attention, or was there any sibling issue with you writing the strip with him?
If there was, I'm not aware of it.
Or just making up for the distribution of attention that goes out to 8 kids over the course of your childhood. Not that I'm trying to raise any family issues.
Yeah, you can certainly raise them, but as Oscar Wilde said, questions are never indiscreet, answers sometimes are. But in this case, there's no indiscreet answer. Mm-hmm. And my parents were remarkable in the way in which they made each child feel special and paid attention to. I don't know how they did it, given the fact that there were so many of us, and
seriously, I'm one of 2, and we got almost no attention. So yeah. that's pretty impressive.
Right. So anyway, that was just a trait of our family that was very real, and I think we all appreciated. I was the oldest, so the fact that I was doing certain things before other people were doing certain things is just natural. And I had come to the conclusion is too strong, but I was definitely inclined towards writing at a very early age, and everyone knew that. I worked in the high school paper, I worked in the college paper, I would write things all the time, and in retrospect, it's a fairly clear trajectory into my working life. It's kind of what it almost seems fated when I look back on it. So the idea that I would start to write and work with my dad again seemed a fairly natural thing. Now, others were involved in the strip, others of my siblings, in various ways. We all took photographs, those thousands of Polaroids of my dad posing. We all posed for photographs when he needed characters who were younger. And my sister Meg did the coloring and the lettering for the strip when she came of age. That's a very significant job. Lettering is an art form in itself.
Oh, it's been the death of comics that they've gone to the computerized lettering.
Right. And, there were great masters of lettering like Ben Oda. And coloring for a strip like Prince Valiant is very complicated. So I was in touch with my sister Meg, who did the coloring the other day, and she was talking about the color templates that you used when you were working with the syndicate. There was something like 150 colors you were able to use, and each one had a number. And she was saying how, after a while, it just became second nature what the different numbers were that went with colors. And she'd be with my dad, they'd be at the beach, it'd be a sunset, and they'd say, gosh, it's really a number 17.
It's like boring synesthesia. That's great.
Yeah, right.
Do you have a favorite strip besides Prince Valiant growing up?
Well, there were a number of that I was very partial to, very divergent. I've always liked Hagar. Now that strip comes relatively late, and so it wasn't one that I was reading in the 50s or 60s because it doesn't start until I think the late 70s. But I thought it was very funny and just beautifully drawn. And Rip Kirby is pretty extraordinary in its, throughout its life. But, it begins with Alex Raymond, who was, a wonderful illustrator. And his life was sadly cut short by a tragic automobile accident. But he brought a kind of, it was both noir and playful at the same time. It was a kind of stylishness that I think if you go back and look at it nowadays, you say to yourself, this is from the 40s? Because it seems so cutting edge in a way. The Heart of Juliet Jones was a strip I actually didn't read very much because it was a romantic melodrama in many ways, but it was so beautifully drawn. Stan Drake was just such an artistic craftsman when it came to human faces in particular, and especially women. So those were some of them. And the ones done by my father's friends, I would always read. High and Lois often had kind of in-jokes in them. You'd read that and you just say, oh, I know that happened on the golf course, back in April. Or people's names would be mentioned. And the same with Beetle Bailey.
And your father would steal faces every so often for the backgrounds and...
Well, my father would, yes. My father loved stealing faces, and he literally would stop strangers or people who were semi-strangers, like, the postman or electrician or janitor at a school, if they looked interesting, and say, you had to explain what you're doing, but, and it can go down a rabbit hole very quickly when you start with, I draw a comic strip and I wonder if you'd like to be in it. But he would...
Not the greatest pickup line ever, but
no,
go on. Yeah.
Exactly. But he would have people come in and pose, and they would. And so, not that anyone would do this, but you could go through, for instance, Big Ben Bolt, and find... I could even point them out because I remember a lot of them. This person is that person, and this person is that person. And there's scores of people found their way into the strip.
Mm-hmm. Like the original Hal Jordan actually being Gil Kane's neighbor, Paul Newman. Have you read about that previously?
No.
Oh, that's why the early issues of Green Lantern, he bears such a strong resemblance to Paul Newman, because that was Gil Kane's next door neighbor, and he wanted somebody who would look like a superhero. I guess that was, in his younger days, exactly who you do. Was your father ever tempted to go Bigfoot style and get away from the realist
Never.
mode?
No, because his...
I think of Stan Drake going from Juliet Jones
to Blondie.
Yeah.
Yes, and Stan is one of the very, very few who was superb at both, and I think tempted to do both. Most people weren't. But for someone like my father, what you have to remember is that he was already on a different track when he started to do a comic strip. He was on the illustration track. And his artistic heroes were people like Norman Rockwell and J.C. Leyendecker and Howard Pyle and N.C. Wyeth and Hal Foster and Alex Raymond. So he saw himself as part of that cadre, and rightly so. And it was because he was doing that kind of work, and at the same time also had a subspecialty in sports, that he was asked by Elliot Kaplan to start doing Big Ben Bolt. So he's firmly on a particular path, and he had no experience doing Bigfoot style comics. He was a very, very good caricaturist, but that's different. And he did caricatures, all his life, starting from when he's basically in grade school, and all the way up until his death. But that's the closest he would have gotten to it. Mm-hmm. But he admired the Bigfoot people, and their work is deceptive. It's not easy to do. People can think anybody could do Hagar, anybody could do Sam Strip or Beetle, but that's not true. How you arrive at those characters to begin with takes a lot of trial and error. They change over time as you begin to realize how you can make them better and more expressive, even though, to a person looking casually, it doesn't seem like anything may have changed.
That's the nice thing with those career-long compendia, when you look at the early, even the early Calvin and Hobbes, when you see what Watterson was drawing like then versus
That's right.
At the peak.
That's right. They're all like that. And
except for Dilbert. I'm kidding. I just always throw that joke in there. So.
And Stan Drake was when he took over Blondie. I remember he would talk about how many hand gestures Dagwood has, and now no reader is going to pick that up and just count them. You're not even going to notice, because it's just what Dagwood is doing is he's very simply getting an idea across because of something that he's doing. But the artist has to know all of these, and as you're drawing them, it's really striking home powerfully how many different poses that he has, and that's just hands. What about eyebrows? And so it's there's a lot going on in these comic strips, no matter how simple they seem.
How did your background with the cartoonists and comics people affect your work as an editor in the magazines in terms of working with illustrators and not commissioning cartoons themselves, right?
No, I've never commissioned cartoons. As a magazine editor, I've certainly worked with illustrators, and enjoyed doing that. The most important lesson, I think, simply has to do with the relationship of text and pictures. And there's a lot that you can say about that interaction. I'm not going to say a lot. But as with what I was saying earlier about how something simple, such as a Bigfoot style cartoon, how something simple is actually much more complex. So is the relationship of text and picture, or it can be, and in many cases should be. For the person who's looking at something, that presents itself as a combination of text and picture, they don't have to do a lot of work, at least that they're conscious of. They put text and picture together in their minds, and whatever the processing equipment is, in your head, it gets on the right wavelength. It understands how there's a 1-2 punch between text and pictures, and how the two of them are combining to move things along very quickly. This is in comic strips. So the perception part is easy. The doing part of it, though, if you're at the other end and you have to create this for the reader, is actually much harder. Figuring out how do you want words to relate to pictures so that they're not doing the same thing, and so that you are advancing a story, rapidly and very economically, without undue overlap. So that part takes more thought. Now, it's different when you're working in a magazine. It's different when you're working with books, but the same general issue presents itself. And so I think working with comic strips and being aware of them so intimately at such an early age actually did help. It did help me appreciate some of the subtleties and demands of what's required when you marry text and pictures.
I'm sitting down with Paul Karasik and Mark Newgarden next week about their How to Read Nancy book, which makes the case very forcefully that there's a lot going on, even in something as simple as an Ernie Bushmiller strip. That's, one of those.
Well, there is. I think there was sometimes a temptation among cartoonists to play that down. They for the most part, just didn't put on airs. They weren't making great claims for what they were doing. It's a living is the kind of idea that you get from them. They didn't talk about what they were doing as art with a capital A, and Ernie Bushmiller in particular, would kind of poo-poo the idea that there was some larger meaning in what he was doing. He would say dumb it down was his advice to people who wanted to do comic strips, which is almost a challenge to academe, I think. He must be hiding something. And have you ever read the
Beckett correspondence?
The Beckett Bushmiller correspondence, and which is so inherently believable. For a lot of reasons, partly because Groucho Marx and T.S. Eliot did have a correspondence. So once you know that, anything becomes almost plausible. And but I love the Bushmiller Beckett correspondence and the cartoons that go with them.
And do you feel how do you feel about I guess comics having much more intellectual and a weirder audience appeal than they once did? They're no longer either superhero stuff for kids the daily strips. It's, the graphic novels in the bookstores, the academic courses on this stuff. How do you feel about it?
Oh, I'm a pretty easygoing chap, okay. And I think it's all fine. I'm glad that the comics, in whatever form, get some kind of serious attention, and I know it comes in various forms. Someone like Brian Walker, who is a true comics historian, or someone like Rick Marshall or Dean Mullaney, have been doing what amounts to comics scholarship for a long period of time. But it's not really the academic sort of stuff that you're talking about, which is the
jargony
criticism. But that kind of stuff needs an outlet, and why not? But as for the new forms that comics are taking, I think it's just great. And I refer on the cover of my book to a golden age of comic strips, which is in fact what my childhood was, in the midst of. But there's, without question, there's a golden age dawning right now in terms of graphic novels.
Except that the cartoonists in Connecticut could actually make a living from doing this stuff, and contemporary cartoonists, it's a little tougher.
It's it's not just a different business model, but there are many different business models that are involved here, and it's directly because of the fact that just to take graphic novels, it's not a mass market phenomenon, and they're not being read by 100 million people, the same ones every week. But that has its advantages too. When you have a mass market, you also have constraints in terms of what you can talk about. There are reasons why race and religion are not huge topics in the comic strips of the 1950s. And it's not necessarily because the people doing comics just had no desire to approach those topics, but it was because you could not. Mm-hmm. Now, when you have a shift from comic work being done primarily for mass market media to books that have much more of a niche market, you're not getting the economic power of the mass market, but you're getting enormous freedom. And so as a result, you do see every topic being addressed in graphic novels.
What did writing Prince Valiant teach you about storytelling? And did any of that translate into your journalism, editing, nonfiction? It's a very specialized type of story, but...
Yes. It taught me a lot. It was not as if I was ever taking what I regarded, or at least consciously perceived, as direct lessons. I see, I've now learned this. But it was just something that acted on you over time. And I would say there are two main things. One is when you're doing a story strip where you have a plot that is progressing over a period of, let's say 13 weeks. It has to start and end in 13 weeks. Plus, each of those 13 episodes, so you've got 13 Sundays to accomplish this. In each one of those Sundays, you've got 8 panels. And each episode on a Sunday also has to accomplish something. It has to have a beginning, middle, and end. So you're very conscious of the shapeliness of storytelling. It has almost an architectural physicality to it. So that's one thing that I know kind of rippled back into my head. And the other thing is the efficiency that is required. You know, when you have no constraints on you, you're tempted to just, write and write and write and write. But when suddenly constraints of a fairly severe nature are imposed on you, you have these 8 panels to work with on a Sunday. Each of those panels can only have so many words. And you have to arrange the words so that you're not stepping on the pictures, but are, sometimes they become a bridge to the next panel. There are many different ways words are used. Sometimes the pictures are the bridge. But whatever the combination is, you have to do this with as few words as possible. So the impetus towards economy, how can I accomplish what I want to with the fewest possible words without losing a certain stylishness? That's the task. And that too is a translatable idea and skill.
I suppose, were there moments you had boy, Dad is not going to want to draw this as you were working on that?
Yes, but it was tempered by the knowledge that he was not going to draw this.
Yeah,
he would just simply say, I can't do, I won't do that, or I can't do that, or we can achieve the effect this way.
Yeah, in that respect, did writing for an artist mirror the editing for a writer? Being the editor, that sense of partnership between writer and artist mirror what you do as an editor?
I wouldn't use the word mirror because it implies too much of a similarity. But the idea of a partnership is definitely accurate. You both had to be aware of the capacities and the function of the other person, and the functions are different. And and I know that I, as a writer, have limits in terms of what I know how to do, and my father had things that he was much better at and preferred doing as compared to other things. And in any kind of partnership, you really do want to, on the one hand, play to one another's strengths, and on the other, to the extent that you can make up for things that the other person is less comfortable doing, that's great.
How's your family responded to the book? I'm sure they helped shape it, or at least contribute to what was there. But
I think they loved the book.
Mm-hmm.
When I was thinking of the audience for the book, I very much had my family in mind. When you're engaged in any writing project, it's not uncommon for the writer to have, a specific individual in mind or some small group. It really just helps you focus things and arrive at the right tone and so on. And in doing this book, I was focused primarily on my family. My parents, first of all. My mother's alive, and in my head, my father's alive. So, those were two important members of the audience. And then my brothers and sisters. And it's, so it's to all of them that the book is is dedicated. So well before it was published, but when I finally had a good working draft, I did send it around to all of them. And, they had some good ideas. They had some corrections. They had some stories that I hadn't known about. And and I think now that it's been done, and the publisher, Farrar Straus, has done an extraordinary job producing this
as a beautiful
as a physical
thing, yeah.
Physical object. I think people are very glad that it exists, and that this world that all of us remember, so personally, is something that we can, pass on literally now to our children and grandchildren, and just the family going forward.
What'd you learn about yourself in the process of writing this?
I was thinking about that the other day. It was someone had asked me a question which was not directly the one that you were asking, but it pushed me in a direction, and I realized that I had emerged from this understanding something that I had not understood before. And it was the degree to which my parents' attitude had empowered the lives of their children. And what I mean by that is this. The cartoonists as a group, and certainly my father as an individual and my mother by inclination, they were very intent on making their own way in life with the tools that they enjoyed working with, and rather than being slotted into a pathway of someone else's devising. There's a reason why these people are not working for big corporations or any place where there's a big set of rules that's being applied to you. And it was difficult for cartoonists, I think, to cobble together a life. It took a lot of ingenuity. You were always aware of the fact that you needed to keep working and find work. And it was very entrepreneurial in some ways. It often required working for many different people or places. But with that came a certain amount of freedom too, and also the sense that you were defining the contours of your career and your life, and that you as an individual had the capacity to do this, that you could take your loves and drives and out of those things make something that was successful. So all the role models in this world are evincing something along these lines. And my parents certainly did. And the implicit lesson, and I'm sure if I were just to think about it further, the explicit lesson was that as you pursue your life, pay attention to what you want to do. What is it on the interior that interests you? What is it that you're good at? What is it that you think you can contribute? You start with those questions and follow where they lead, rather than starting with some vision of what a perfect life is supposed to be and imposing it on yourself. So I think that's the most important thing that my parents gave to each of the children. And it's something that I had not, to get back to your question, had not really focused on until, as I was writing the book, that subject actually became very clear.
Which makes the next question seem like an anticlimax, but you're the third guest who has a degree in medieval history or literature, and seemingly the only one who's actually leveraged that into at least part of his career. The other one is a great book reviewer for the Washington Post and the woman who curates the comics library up at Columbia, neither of which has anything to do with their medieval history backgrounds. Do you feel you got your money's worth out of pursuing that course of study?
Medieval history is fascinating. Those who don't study it probably are not aware of the extent to which so much of the modern world actually has its roots in the Middle Ages. And I found it to be a very useful way of just having an access point into understanding how civilizations are put together. So I have no regrets. And even if I hadn't gone on to write Prince Valiant, I would have had no regrets.
Last question. Any tips for drawing chainmail? That was always our question growing up, reading Prince Valiant. How does he draw all that little...
I wish I had the answer to that. It's if you go and look at originals by my father or by Hal Foster, you'll see how artfully it is done and how much of a suggestion of chainmail can be achieved with relatively little ink.
Just a couple of little.
That's right.
Little U's.
That's right. It's like bricks in a house.
No need to draw.
You don't need to draw them all.
That's a good place for us to leave off. Cullen,
well, thank you very much, Gil.
Well, thanks for coming on. And that was Cullen Murphy. His brand new book is Cartoon County, My Father and His Friends in the Golden Age of Make-Believe, published by Farrar, Straus Giroux. It's a lovely book and just a beautiful physical object, so maybe you ought to think about getting that as a holiday present for one of your cartooning interested loved ones. And you can find Cullen's site at cullenmurphy.com. And that's CULLENMURPHY. And you'll find links to his past books, reviews, his book tour schedule, etc. But you should also visit Vanity Fair and The Atlantic's websites and look up his editorials and his stories there, because he's a heck of a writer. Now, once we wrapped up the main session, I asked Cullen, so, who are you reading? If you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The new episode of that went up a few weeks ago with an hour of extra material from our past guests. You can get access by supporting the show at patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. There are all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, series of ebooks that I will maybe get around to launching in that week between Christmas and New Year's, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. As I mentioned, I recorded the segment with Cullen at the Vanity Fair offices in New York. I took the train from Newark rather than drive into the city, so it was $16 for parking, about $6 for the train, maybe $10 for breakfast at the, at a fancy breakfast place and coffee shop at the Oculus, that big shopping mall and transit stop at the World Trade Center, which is sort of the subject of this week's email. You'll get that. Anyway, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or if you just want to toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Special thanks go out to Kevin Katila, John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Stephen Nadler, Wallace Wilde Minozzi, Noah Van Sciver, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Craig P. Steffen, Jack Les Camella, and Ron Slate for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. And that's it for this week's Virtual Memories show. Thanks so much for listening. Next week will be our annual guest list episode where we get all of 2017, well, as many of them as I can get, 2017's guests to tell us about the favorite book they read last year and the book or author they're hoping to tackle next year. And then it's a week off as we get ready for 2018 and the 250th episode of the show. Until next time, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store or at soundcloud.com/VMSpod. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at facebook.com/Virtual Memories show, and at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. Oh, and we're on YouTube, and you can find us just by searching for Virtual Memories. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes Store, look up the Virtual Memories show, and leave a rating and review for us. That'll help us build a bigger audience. Till next time, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.